Caves are mysterious, beautiful, and deadly. They lure explorers into their depths, but one wrong move can turn an adventure into a nightmare. Today, we uncover 4 tragic cave disasters where nature proved merciless. These are the stories of ambition, miscalculation, and the terrifying power of the underground. Let's begin. Mossdale Cave Incident. It was June 24th, 1967. 10 cavers prepared to enter Mossdale Cavern, one of the most challenging cave systems in England. Their goal? To clear deeper passages and map them out. The group was led by 2 experienced cavers who had explored the cave before, reassuring the others. Mossdale was infamous for its tight spaces and claustrophobic tunnels. Areas where standing upright was nearly impossible. After a few hours, 4 of the cavers decided to return to the surface, overwhelmed by the cave's difficulty. They noticed the cloudy sky, but thought little of it. Meanwhile, the remaining 6 cavers pressed on, reaching the far Marathon Passage, a dangerously narrow corridor measuring just 18 inches by 12 inches, with a small stream flowing along the bottom. Back on the surface, the weather took a turn for the worse. Rain began falling lightly, but soon it escalated into a downpour. The group outside took shelter, unaware of the catastrophe unfolding below. Inside the cave, the cavers began noticing rising water levels. What started as a small trickle soon became a rushing torrent. Realizing the danger, they made the decision to turn back. But they were still 3 hours away from the entrance. Above ground, panic set in as the surface team saw something horrifying. A lake of water had formed at the cave's entrance. The cavers inside had no idea how much water was about to flood their path. Rescue efforts began immediately. Volunteers and professionals pumped oxygen into the cave and tried to drain the water, but it was hopeless. The cave filled rapidly, leaving no time for escape, and all drowned. Shaft Sinkhole Tragedy. It was May 28, 1973. A team of 9 divers gathered at Mount Gambier's Shaft Sinkhole in South Australia. This was no ordinary diving site. The entrance was a tiny opening leading straight down into an underwater lake, 20 feet below. Sunlight streamed through the opening, creating a guiding beam that illuminated the cave, but only if divers stayed within range. On the first day, the team agreed to stay within a 200-foot depth limit, ensuring they remained in the main chamber where the light was still visible. However, on the second day, 4 divers decided to push beyond the limit, venturing deeper to 250 feet in an attempt to set a new record. This significantly increased the danger because, in 1973, divers only had access to regular air tanks rather than specialized mixed gas tanks. This meant that the deeper they went, the more nitrogen built up in their bloodstream. At high pressures, this leads to nitrogen narcosis, a condition that mimics extreme drunkenness, impairing judgment and motor skills. These divers had little experience in cave diving, as they were more familiar with standard open water scuba diving. This inexperience only increased the danger of their plan. As the divers descended into the western section of the cave, one of them realized something was wrong. The effects of nitrogen narcosis were setting in. He quickly turned back, warning the others. Several followed him, but 4 divers refused to turn around. The group at the surface waited anxiously for their teammates to reappear. But they never did. Some of the divers went back to the cave. Searching for them found only a flashlight and a camera at the bottom. There was a critical danger they hadn't accounted for. Silt. As the divers moved, they stirred up a dense cloud of fine sediment, instantly reducing visibility to nearly zero. What was once a clear path became an impenetrable haze, leaving them disoriented and unable to navigate. With no way to see their surroundings, oxygen running dangerously low, and nitrogen narcosis impairing their judgment, the 4 divers were trapped. One by one, they succumbed to the depth. Jacob's Well Tragedy, November 23, 1983. 2 students from Texas State University, Richard and Clark, stood at the edge of Jacob's Well, an infamous underwater cave in Texas. At first glance, Jacob's Well looks harmless, a simple hole in a shallow riverbed about 25 feet deep. But beneath the surface, the cave system extends much deeper. It consists of 3 chambers. The first 2 are relatively open and easily get through, but third one has very narrow entrance to get through. And past the 3rd chamber, there's a tiny opening, which goes to a dangerously narrow tunnel of 2 feet diameter, far too small for anyone to pass through. 2 years prior, 2 divers had died here, trapped when a rock slide filled the narrow tunnel with gravel. Their bodies were eventually recovered by an experienced instructor named Don, who later tried to seal the small hole that leads to the fourth chamber with cement to prevent future tragedies. But defiant divers broke down the barrier bit by bit, leaving a note that read, "You can't keep us out." Richard and Clark were reasonably skilled in regular scuba diving, but had no real experience with cave diving. At the time, they were in the process of earning their certification as open water diving instructors, but they wanted to see the cave themselves even though they were inexperienced. On November 23, 1983, Richard and Clark entered Jacob's Well and made their way to the third chamber, where the narrow hole was located. In an attempt to squeeze through, Richard removed his tank and began pushing himself into the passage while holding it. When Clark followed and looked ahead, he saw Richard's face. Panicked and desperate, Richard had lost hold of his tank and was now suffocating. Acting quickly, Clark handed him his own regulator, allowing Richard a precious breath of air. The two began sharing the regulator, passing it back and forth as they struggled through the tight squeeze of the third chamber and somehow came out. Just as they thought they were escaping towards the exit, a sharp clank sound terrified them. Their tank had hit a wall. Not only did it mean they were heading in the wrong direction, but it also signaled that their tank was nearly empty. They had entered the false chimney, a dead-end tunnel in the first chamber. Clark, in a desperate burst of energy, swam 75 feet in a single breath and broke the surface, barely alive. But Richard never made it out and drowned. Gollum's Cave Tragedy. It was August 18th, 2005, when 5 friends decided to explore Gollum's Cave, infamously known as the Cave of Death, due to its treacherous conditions. They arrived at the entrance at around 3 a.m., a time when even the bravest explorers hesitate. One friend, sensing the risk, chose to remain outside while the other 4 ventured in. Their first challenge came right at the entrance, a shallow pool of water they had to crawl through just to get inside. A few steps later, the path split in two. They took the left fork, which led to another pool. It seemed harmless at first, but hidden beneath was a narrow underwater tunnel that connected to a deeper part of the cave. The tunnel was extremely narrow, just 3 to 4 feet in diameter, and completely underwater. To pass through, each person had to fully submerge and swim single file for about 15 feet, one at a time. One by one, they plunged into the water, slipping through the narrow tunnel and emerging into a chamber with barely 3 feet of breathable airspace above the water. Meanwhile, the friend who had stayed outside noticed the cave had gone completely silent. No sounds, no light. Growing concerned, he went into the cave, but still heard nothing and saw no light. Unsure what to do, he contacted a few friends with caving experience, then called the police. Inside the cave, the situation was far more terrible than anyone outside could have imagined. The 4 friends who went in probably realized that air in the 3-feet chamber was bad air, which is the term cavers refer to as an abnormal mix of air with low oxygen and high carbon dioxide. It can dull your thinking, weaken your muscles, and make it difficult to breathe, especially critical when you're about to swim back through a tight underwater tunnel. One by one, they tried to make the return journey, but the first person who went underwater couldn't find the exit and ran out of breath. The high levels of carbon dioxide made it harder to think clearly and hold her breath. About 30 to 60 seconds later, the second person followed, found her, and got stuck too. One by one, the others did the same until all of them were trapped in the tunnel. By the time rescue team arrived and tried to pump in oxygen and remove water, it was too late. All 4 divers had died. The tragedy shook the local community, and the cave, already known as the Cave of Death, was eventually sealed with cement to prevent any future accidents.